If you're too chicken to handle horror, then this story is not for you. Please, turn away now before the darkness seeps in. This tale is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who seek the thrill of shadows and the chill of whispers in the dark. If you choose to stay, let this be your warning. For beyond the bends of the road, and beneath the fog lies a forgotten village. And what waits there has been waiting a very long time. The car hummed softly along the two-lane highway, slicing through the quiet countryside. The morning sun glinted off the windshield as Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the endless rows of trees lining the road. Beside him, Emily flipped through a well-worn road atlas, her fingers tracing faded lines and dots that marked towns they would never stop in. In the back seat, little Sophie dozed off, her small head bobbing gently with the car's movements, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. The air was light, and the world seemed safe. The radio played an old song, its notes floating through the cabin. They had been driving for hours, a family road trip born of boredom and a desire for something different. Thomas had suggested they take a detour, a scenic route through the countryside to a place no one seemed to talk about anymore, a village Emily had found on an old map. Its name faded with time. A place called Briar's Hollow. It sounded quaint, and the thought of exploring something off the beaten path appealed to them all. They were chasing a quiet adventure, a lazy afternoon spent meandering through forgotten streets. The landscape began to change as they drove deeper into the hills. Trees grew denser, their branches arching over the road like the ribs of some ancient beast. The light dimmed, and the air grew cooler. The road twisted and narrowed, the asphalt cracked and worn. They passed old signs half swallowed by weeds, the letters barely legible. Briar's Hollow, 5 miles. Emily pointed it out with a laugh, her voice light. Thomas smiled, pressing the accelerator gently, eager to see what lay ahead. Sophie stirred in the back, rubbing her eyes and peering out the window, her gaze catching on the trees that seemed to lean closer, their leaves rustling in an unseen breeze. The road dipped, and the car descended into a small valley, the trees closing in tighter. Thomas glanced at the gas gauge, half a tank plenty for the trip. They had no worries, no reason to fear. The world was still familiar, but as they rounded a sharp bend, they saw it, an old, rusted sign, leaning at an angle, almost swallowed by vines. It simply read Briar's Hollow. No population, no slogan, just the name. And beyond it, a narrow gravel path broke away from the main road, vanishing into the trees. Thomas slowed the car, turning onto the gravel, the tires crunching over stones. Emily smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Sophie pressed her face to the window, watching the woods slide past, her breath fogging the glass. The path seemed to twist endlessly, the trees growing thicker, the sunlight dimming further. After a while, Thomas frowned. It felt like they'd been driving much longer than 5 miles, the road winding on and on without any sign of a village. Emily glanced at the map, her brow furrowed. The lines on the page didn't seem to match what they were seeing. Thomas's fingers tapped nervously on the wheel. Sophie yawned, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Are we there yet?" Thomas forced a smile. "Almost, hey, IDDO. Just a bit further." But as the car rolled forward, the trees seemed to press in tighter, their trunks old and gnarled, their roots twisting out from the earth like grasping fingers. The air grew heavier and cooler. The radio crackled, a soft static whispering beneath the music. Emily reached to adjust it, but the knob spun uselessly beneath her fingers. The road narrowed to a single lane, the gravel thinning until it became little more than packed earth. Thomas's hands gripped the wheel tighter. He glanced at Emily, her smile fading. Sophie shifted in her seat, her eyes wide now, no longer sleepy. The trees whispered, a low rustling sound that seemed to move with them, always just at the edge of hearing. Thomas felt a shiver crawl down his spine, a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. And still, they drove on. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as the family's car moved deeper into the woods. The trees on either side seemed to lean in closer, their branches intertwining above the road, forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. A strange stillness settled in, the air growing thicker, heavier. The usual sounds of the countryside, birds calling, leaves rustling, had faded into an unnatural hush. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Emily glanced at Thomas, her fingers fidgeting with the map in her lap. The lines on the page were faint, the name Briar's Hollow barely readable beneath her fingertip. "This can't be right," she muttered under her breath. Thomas didn't respond, his eyes locked on the narrow road ahead. The path twisted and dipped, bordered by trees whose trunks were thick with moss, their roots bulging from the earth like veins. Sophie shifted in the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter. She stared out the window, her little brow furrowed. "Mommy, why does it look so dark here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily turned to her with a forced smile. "It's just the trees, sweetheart. They're big and old. They make the road look darker." But her voice wavered, and Thomas could feel the tension rising in the car like the pressure before a storm. The road seemed endless now. It twisted left, then right, then doubled back in a loop that felt familiar. Thomas frowned. "Have we passed that tree before?" he muttered, pointing at a massive oak with a scarred trunk. Emily peered out the window. Her hands gripped the map tighter, her knuckles whitening. A flicker of movement caught Thomas's eye. A shape darting between the trees low to the ground quick. He slowed the car, peering into the shadows. But there was nothing there. Just trees, dense and unmoving. Sophie whimpered softly. The road straightened suddenly, opening into a small clearing. In the center stood an old wooden sign, its paint faded and chipped, barely readable. It leaned to one side, as if pushed by time and wind. Thomas squinted at the words, "Briar's Hollow Estate, 1832. The village's name was carved in the wood, barely legible beneath layers of moss. Emily let out a nervous laugh, though it sounded strained. "Well, we found it," she said softly. But as they rolled forward, they realized something strange. There were no other cars, no houses visible yet, no signs of life. The trees began to thin, and the car crept down a narrow street lined with buildings that looked like they belonged to another time. Weathered wood, cracked windows, and faded paint. The buildings leaned slightly, as if the years had weighed too heavily on their foundations. A chill settled into Thomas's chest. There were no people, no lights in the windows, no sounds of children playing, no voices. Emily shifted uneasily in her seat, her eyes scanning the storefronts. A general store stood on the left, its windows streaked with grime. A barber shop with a spinning pole, frozen in place, sat on the right. A church steeple peeked over the rooftops, but its bell was silent. Thomas slowed the car to a crawl. Sophie clutched her rabbit tighter, her wide eyes staring at the empty streets. "Where is everyone?" she whispered. Her voice seemed too loud in the quiet, echoing softly. Thomas stopped the car in the middle of the street. The air felt heavier here, thick and almost damp. He rolled down the window slightly, the smell of old wood and something faintly sweet like decaying flowers drifting in. Emily turned in her seat, looking down the street. A shape caught her eye, something standing at the far end of the road. She squinted. It looked like a person. A man, perhaps, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat. He stood perfectly still, facing away from them. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice barely a breath. Thomas followed her gaze. The figure didn't move, didn't turn. He just stood there, motionless. Thomas felt the hair on his arms rise. "Maybe we should just turn around," he muttered, a knot tightening in his stomach. But as he glanced at the road behind them, it seemed narrower now, the trees pressing closer together, the path they had taken looking unfamiliar, almost like it had shifted. Sophie whimpered again, a soft sound that cut through the stillness. The figure at the end of the street turned slightly, as if hearing her. But the face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Thomas's hand hovered over the gear shift, his pulse thudding in his ears. And then the figure was gone. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the figure vanished into the fog. Emily turned sharply, her eyes darting across the empty street. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows dark, their doors closed tight. The stillness seemed thicker now, the silence pressing in on them like a weighted blanket. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his fingers tightening on the wheel until his knuckles blanched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure behind them. But the street lay empty, swallowed by fog that drifted low and slow across the ground. The car idled quietly, its engine humming like a distant insect in the hush. Sophie shifted in the back seat, her small hands gripping the edge of her seatbelt. She stared out the window, her eyes wide and unblinking. "I don't like it here, Daddy," she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas swallowed hard, the cold sweat breaking across his forehead. The map in Emily's lap fluttered as she exhaled, her fingers trembling. "Maybe we should turn around," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Thomas nodded slowly and reached for the gear shift, his hand hovering as if expecting it to vanish beneath his touch. He pressed the pedal, but the car didn't move. The tires spun, but the car barely inched forward, as if something unseen held it in place. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing. He eased off the pedal, then tried again, more forcefully. The tires spun, kicking up gravel, but the car groaned like a trapped animal, lurching forward only a few feet before coming to an abrupt stop. Emily's breathing quickened. "What's happening?" she whispered. Thomas shook his head, his heart pounding. He opened the door and stepped out, the crunch of his boots loud in the quiet. The air smelled musty, damp with the scent of decaying leaves and something older, something sour and metallic. He crouched down, inspecting the tires. They weren't stuck in mud or caught on anything visible, yet the car felt heavy, as if an invisible hand held it in place. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound like a soft tapping, distant and hollow. Thomas straightened slowly, his breath misting in the air. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty street. Emily opened her door and stepped out as well, her shoes crunching softly. Sophie stayed in the car, her face pressed against the glass, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her arms as if to ward off the sudden chill. The tapping sound grew louder, more distinct. It seemed to echo from somewhere down the street, near a row of buildings partially obscured by fog. Thomas's gaze fixed on the corner where the figure had stood before. It was empty now, but the air seemed to hum, as if vibrating with a presence unseen. "Let's just leave," Emily whispered, her voice tight with fear. Thomas nodded, but something compelled him forward, a pull he couldn't explain. His feet moved of their own accord, crunching softly over the gravel as he approached the intersection. The fog swirled, curling around his legs like smoke. A faint shape materialized through the haze, and narrow path leading off the main street, overgrown with weeds, its entrance marked by two weathered posts. An old, rusted sign hung crookedly between them, the letters almost worn away. Thomas squinted, tilting his head. The words were barely legible. "Hollow Road." He called back to Emily, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I think this is the way." Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Thomas, please, let's just turn around. This place, it's wrong." But Thomas felt the pull stronger now, like a thin thread winding itself around his chest, drawing him in. His hand hovered near the sign, fingers brushing the worn wood. The tapping sound seemed louder now, closer, as if coming from the buildings beyond. Emily stepped forward, grabbing his arm. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "Please," she pleaded. Thomas turned to her, his face pale, but before he could speak, a sudden noise cut through the stillness, a child's laughter, soft and sweet, drifting from somewhere down the foggy street. "Sophie!" Thomas's heart clenched, and he spun toward the sound. But Sophie was still in the car, her face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with fear. The laughter echoed again, this time from deeper within the fog, beckoning, playful yet wrong. Thomas froze, the hair on his neck rising. Emily's grip tightened on his arm, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The fog thickened, swirling in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. and the tapping continued, steady and slow. It echoed off the buildings, filling the empty air with its hollow rhythm. Thomas took a step back, his pulse hammering in his ears, and the fog seemed to shift with him, curling and retreating ever so slightly. The stillness was oppressive now, the village holding its breath, waiting. He looked at Emily, her face pale and drawn. "Let's get back in the car," he whispered. But the laughter echoed once more, softer now, fading into the fog, and the air felt colder still. The family scrambled back into the car, Thomas slamming the driver's side door shut with a thud that echoed unnaturally down the empty street. Emily yanked her door closed, her breathing fast and shallow. Sophie whimpered softly, clutching her stuffed rabbit tight, her wide eyes locked on the swirling fog beyond the window. Thomas twisted the key in the ignition, the engine stuttering before catching with a weak rumble. It had swallowed the street entirely, leaving only the faint outlines of the leaning buildings. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. Emily's voice broke the silence, a thin, shaking whisper. What was that?" Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if expecting the fog itself to press through the windows. Sophie whimpered again, her voice a thin thread. "Mommy, I want to go home." Thomas's heart raced. He reached for the gear shift, pushing it into reverse, but the car only groaned, the tires spinning without traction. It felt like trying to escape from a nightmare where the rules of the world no longer apply. The fog coiled closer, swirling against the glass, distorting the view beyond. The buildings wavered like mirages, their forms shifting and stretching in unnatural ways. And then, just beyond the edge of the windshield, Thomas saw it, a figure, standing perfectly still in the middle of the street, barely visible through the fog. The same figure as before, the man in the dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat obscuring his face. This time, he was closer, maybe 20 feet away. Thomas's breath caught, and he felt Emily's hand clutch his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there as though waiting. The fog twisted around him, almost as if it obeyed his presence. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned to Emily, voice low, urgent. "I'm going to try to back out. Hold on." He pressed the pedal harder, the engine revving, but the car shuddered, as if caught in the invisible grip of the village itself. The figure in the street didn't flinch, didn't step aside, just watched. And then, without warning, the fog seemed to part slightly. Just for a moment, the figure was gone. In its place, a small wooden crate sat in the middle of the street, its lid half open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Thomas's breath hitched, his skin crawling. Emily shook her head, her voice barely audible. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He stared at the box, unsure whether to get out and investigate or to stay inside and wait. The air around them was still heavy, the fog curling like smoke, almost sentient. Suddenly, a soft creak echoed from the left, drawing their attention to a building near the car. The front door of what looked like an old general store was slowly swinging open, its hinges groaning in the quiet. A single, dim light flickered inside, barely visible through the grime on the windows. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at Emily, who shook her head in silent protest, her eyes wide with fear. But something in the back of his mind, something cold and unwelcome, whispered that they might not have a choice. The fog seemed to press tighter around the car, as though urging them forward. Sophie whimpered, her voice a tiny, trembling whisper. "Daddy, there's someone in the window." Thomas turned sharply, following her gaze. In the window of the general store, a shadow moved, a dark silhouette, watching them from behind the glass. It was too tall, too still. The figure seemed to tilt its head slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. Thomas swallowed hard, the taste of metal sharp in his mouth. He reached for the door handle, pausing as Emily's hand gripped his arm again. "Thomas." "No," she whispered, but he shook his head, trying to steady his voice. "We can't just sit here. Maybe someone inside can help us." Emily's eyes were full of fear, but she didn't stop him. Her grip loosened, and Thomas took a breath, then opened the door. The air outside felt colder, heavier, as if it pressed down on him. He stepped out cautiously, the fog curling around his legs, each footstep sounding unnaturally loud on the gravel. The door of the general store creaked again, the opening wider now. The light inside flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. Thomas's heart pounded, his breath shallow. The figure in the window had vanished. Thomas glanced back at the car. Emily sat frozen in the passenger seat, her hands gripping Sophie's arm as the child clutched her rabbit, wide-eyed with terror. Thomas forced himself to take another step, his breath catching with each movement. The soft tapping sound rose again from the depths of the fog, slow, steady, and patient, matching the pulse in his ears. His foot crunched on the gravel as he neared the door of the general store, its weathered frame creaking slightly in the shifting breeze. The tapping seemed to echo in time with his heartbeat, a syncopated rhythm that scraped at his nerves. His breath formed small, uneven clouds that hung in the cold air, each one fading slowly like the last trace of warmth. The door swayed gently, a slow, groaning motion that seemed to breathe a quiet invitation and a soft, dreadful warning. Thomas hesitated on the threshold. The smell struck him first, a damp, musty scent laced with the sharp tang of something burnt, old, and long forgotten. The light inside flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across shelves that sagged beneath the weight of forgotten items. Jars lined the walls, their contents murky and unidentifiable, glinting faintly in the dim light. The floor creaked beneath his step, each board groaning as though the building itself were protesting his presence. The fog slithered in behind him, curling lower on his feet like smoke seeking an open flame. Thomas's eyes darted across the room, tracing the contours of the faded shelves, the cracked cash register, the worn counter carved by time. The air felt thick in here, syrupy and heavy, as though it had been held still for years. His ears strained for the source of the tapping, but the sound drifted, shifting sometimes behind him, sometimes ahead, never quite in the same place. A soft creak echoed from deeper inside. Thomas froze, his breath sharp in his throat. The doorway to the back room gaped wide, dark as an open mouth. Beyond the ragged edge of light, something moved, too fast, too subtle, but unmistakable. A shadow flitting across the far wall. Thomas swallowed hard, the cold pressing in tighter. He cast a glance back toward the car. Through the grime-smeared window, he could just make out Emily's pale, terrified face, her hands pressed against the glass. Sophie sat rigid beside her, gripping her rabbit with such force it looked like the seams might tear. Emily's lips moved, silently shaping words he couldn't hear, but Thomas didn't need sound to know what she was saying. "Come back." But Thomas's feet moved of their own accord. A low, dragging sound, like fabric brushing over wood, rose from the darkness beyond the counter. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat like a warning drum in the quiet. And then he saw it, a figure, barely more than a shape, tall and thin, its form shrouded in tattered cloth that seemed to sway with the air itself. It stood in the far corner, where the flickering light barely reached. A face, or something like it, hidden beneath the brim of a wide, shadowed hat. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat. His mouth opened, but no words came. His throat felt dry, tight, as if the air had thickened into dust. The figure did not move. It did not speak. It only watched, still as the grave. The tapping resumed, louder now, sharper and insistent, irregular rhythm that clawed at Thomas's nerves. His gaze snapped to the counter. A music box sat there, all delicate, its wood etched with faded patterns. The lid lay open, the small cylinder spinning slowly. A broken, dissonant tune spilled from it, notes fractured and discordant, like a lullaby sung through broken teeth. Thomas's fingers hovered over it, drawn in by the intricate carvings. The strange hum of its sound. A small, tarnished key protruded from the side, half-turned, dull with age. The shadows deepened, heavy and slow, the figure in the corner shifting ever so slightly, a barely perceptible tilt of the head. Thomas's breath faltered, the air around him turning thick and heavy. The pressure built in his chest, a suffocating weight. His pulse thundered in his ears, a roaring, deafening sound. He stumbled back, his shoulder colliding with a shelf. A glass jar tumbled and shattered on the floor, releasing a foul, cloying smell of rot and earth. The dust bloomed in the air, thick and choking. The figure took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. Each footfall seemed to sink into the ground, a soft but weighty thump that carried too much gravity, too much dread. Thomas backed away, breath ragged, hands raised in silent, trembling surrender. His voice finally broke through the knot in his throat, a fractured whisper. "Please, we didn't mean to." The figure paused. The music box's song stuttered, the notes slowing as if the air itself had thickened around them. Outside, Emily's voice rang out, muffled but sharp, cutting through the tension like a crack in glass. "Thomas, get back in the car." The spell snapped. Thomas spun and bolted for the door. The fog seemed to recoil, swirling back as he stumbled into the street, lungs burning, his breath ragged. Emily yanked open the car door as he reached it, her hand grabbing his sleeve, pulling him inside. Thomas slammed the door shut, chest heaving, heart pounding. "What did you see?" Emily's voice trembled, her eyes wide, wild. But before Thomas could answer, the fog thickened once more, coiling in tight around them. The figure was gone, and so was the music box. The street lay silent, heavy, save for the soft, steady tapping that echoed faintly everywhere at once. Sophie whimpered, her voice small and tight, barely a breath. "Daddy, someone's standing by the car." Thomas's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, and there, just outside Sophie's window, stood the figure, closer than ever before. The figure stood motionless, inches from Sophie's window. Its face was still obscured beneath the wide-brimmed hat, but Thomas could feel its gaze heavy and cold, pressing in through the glass like an icy hand. Sophie let out a sharp, stuttering sob, her breath fogging the window in frantic, uneven bursts. Emily twisted in her seat, her hand flying out to shield her daughter, her voice a tight, whispered plea. "Don't look, baby, don't look." Thomas's heart thundered in his chest. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the soft tapping that seemed to fill the car. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, every muscle in his body screaming to move, to flee. But the car remained still heavy, unresponsive. The tires sat idle against the gravel, as if they had sunk into the earth itself. The figure shifted slightly. It tilted its head, a slow, unnatural angle that made Thomas's skin crawl. The fog around it thickened, coiling in tendrils that wrapped around the figure's long coat, blending it with the swirling mist. Its presence felt wrong, ancient, heavy with something dark and hungry. Thomas's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He tried the gear shift again, yanking it into reverse, pressing the pedal down hard. The engine revved, roaring in protest, but the car barely budged. The fog seemed to push against them, a weightless barrier that held them in place. Emily's voice was sharp, panicked. "Thomas, we have to go." Sophie's cries turned into sharp, hiccuping sobs, her small body trembling in her seat. She clutched her rabbit so tightly now that the fabric strained at the seams. Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the ignition, turning the key off, then on again. The engine sputtered, choked, then roared back to life, but still, they didn't move. The fog had wrapped around them completely, a cocoon of swirling white that swallowed the village whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. No trace, no sound, only the fog drifting in lazy patterns against the windows. Sophie's breathing hitched, her wide eyes darting back and forth, searching the mist for the figure's return. Thomas swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach twisting tighter. He glanced at Emily, her face pale, eyes hollow with fear. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Did you see it?" Emily nodded, a sharp, frantic movement. Her fingers clutched at her seatbelt like a lifeline. It was standing right there watching. Thomas's hand hovered over the gear shift. He pressed the gas, the engine revving again, louder this time, but the car remained fixed in place. The fog pulsed around them, shifting and thickening, as if alive. And then, a sound faint but distinct, a soft, rhythmic knocking. It echoed from somewhere ahead, muffled, and distant at first, but growing louder. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. Sophie whimpered, her voice barely audible. Who's knocking? Thomas's blood ran cold. He strained to see through the fog, the windshield offering only swirling white. The sound continued, steady, insistent. Knock, knock, knock. He glanced at Emily, whose face had drained of all color. Her eyes were fixed on something ahead, wide and unblinking. Thomas followed her gaze, and there it was, just barely visible through the fog, an outline, a shape of a door, freestanding in the middle of the street. No walls, just the door. Its surface was cracked and weathered, paint peeling in long strips, and at its center, a brass knocker swinging slowly, as if recently touched. The knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed too loudly in the quiet. Thomas's hands trembled. He tried to reverse again, to force the car to move, but the tires only spun. The fog seemed to press tighter, thickening like a clenched fist around them. The door in the street stood impossibly tall, an anomaly in the world that made no sense, its presence absurd and terrifying. Emily's voice was a ragged whisper. Thomas, it's waiting. The door swung open. A cold gust of air blasted through the car, filling the cabin with a scent of earth and rot, of something old and forgotten. Sophie screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the fog. Thomas twisted around in his seat, desperate, helpless. Emily reached for Sophie, pulling her close, her own voice breaking in frantic whispers of reassurance. Through the open door, the fog churned, thick and dark. Shapes seemed to shift within it, shadows that twisted and swirled, never fully forming, never fully vanishing. And then a voice, low, rasping, a whisper carried on the fog. Come inside. The words seemed to curl into the car, filling every space, every breath. The fog pulsed once more, and the knocking stopped. The door remained open, waiting. Thomas's voice was hoarse, a broken sound. We have to go. But the car remained still. The fog closed in tighter, and the door loomed, open and waiting. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The fog thickened, swirling slowly, pressing against the car's windows like pale hands. Thomas's chest ached with the weight of fear, every breath a struggle. Sophie's sobs quieted into soft whimpers, her small body trembling in Emily's arms. Thomas could barely hear the engine anymore. The car's hum was swallowed by the fog, muffled and distant, as if it were slipping away from the world itself. Emily's voice broke the stillness, barely above a whisper. Thomas, it's getting closer. Thomas turned, his breath catching. Outside, the fog parted just enough to reveal something, shapes in the windows of the nearby buildings. Shadowy forms, still, watching. Faces pale and blurred, pressed against the glass like forgotten photographs faded by time. Eyes dark, empty, following every movement they made. His mouth went dry. He could feel the weight of their gaze, hundreds of them, silent and still, hidden in the fog, watching. The street beyond the car seemed to shift and ripple, the edges of the buildings blurring as if they were melting into the mist. A cold sweat trickled down Thomas's spine. Sophie whimpered, burying her face in Emily's shoulder. Emily stroked her hair, whispering soft, trembling words. Thomas's hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This isn't real, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It can't be real, but it was. A sudden knock, sharp, distinct on the rear window. Thomas jerked in his seat, spinning to look. For a split second, he saw it, a pale hand, fingers long and thin, pressed against the glass. The skin stretched tight, almost translucent, as if it had been dried and pulled taut. The nails were dark, cracked, and the fingers twitched ever so slightly before vanishing into the fog. Thomas's breath hitched. Emily let out a sharp gasp, her grip tightening on Sophie. The child whimpered, curling smaller in her mother's arms. Thomas twisted back to the front, heart racing, sweat cold against his skin. The fog pulsed again, thicker now, coiling against the windshield. The tapping returned faster this time, an irregular rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere. Windows, roof, doors. Each tap a sharp, hollow echo that sent chills down Thomas's spine. He tried the ignition again, the engine sputtering and growling. The tires spun uselessly, the fog pushing in from all sides like a living thing, wrapping the car in a cocoon of silence and cold. And then he heard it. It seeped into the car like a draft, curling around his ears. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that sank into Thomas's bones. Emily heard it too, her eyes widened in terror, and she clutched Sophie tighter. Thomas turned his head slowly, breath caught in his throat. In the window beside Emily, a face. Pale, hollow-eyed, a smile stretched to wide, lips cracked, revealing teeth too many and too sharp. The skin was wrong pale and thin, stretched over sharp angles, as if the face had been sculpted from wax and left to melt. The eyes were deep, endless pits that seemed to pull Thomas in. The smile didn't move, but the eyes, they followed. Emily let out a choked sob, and the figure vanished, melting back into the fog. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Thomas's hand shook as he gripped the wheel, his breath ragged. He glanced at Emily, who stared straight ahead, her face pale and blank, tears streaking down her cheeks. Sophie whimpered softly, her eyes wide and hollow. "We have to do something," Thomas whispered. "But what?" The car was trapped. The fog pressed tighter. The watchers, those silent figures in the windows, remained still, their eyes hollow and endless. The hum grew louder, rising like a distant storm. And then, through the fog, Thomas saw movement, a shape gliding across the street, slow and deliberate. The same figure from before, the wide-brimmed hat low over its face, the long coat brushing the ground. It moved past the car, head tilted slightly, as if listening. And as it passed, Thomas could see the outlines of others behind it, dozens of them. Figures half-formed in the fog, their faces blurred, their bodies distorted like reflections in rippling water. They drifted in silence, their feet barely brushing the ground, as if carried by the mist itself. Emily's voice trembled. "Thomas, they're all around us." Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He pressed the gas again, the engine roaring uselessly. The car shuddered, but the fog held firm. The figures continued to gather, surrounding the car, in a silent procession. And as the fog swirled closer, Sophie's voice broke through the stillness, small and terrified. "They're whispering my name." Thomas's blood turned cold at the sound of Sophie's voice. The innocence in her words, the quiet fear laced into every syllable, struck deeper than any scream could have. He turned sharply in his seat, heart pounding, his breath ragged. Sophie sat rigid, her small hands clutching her rabbit, her wide eyes fixed on something beyond the glass, unblinking. Her lips moved slowly, as if repeating a name she heard whispered from somewhere beyond the fog. "Sophie," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. She cupped the child's face gently, trying to draw her gaze. But Sophie barely seemed to register her mother's touch. Her lips kept moving, silent and mechanical, like she was trapped in some trance. Thomas leaned closer, listening hard, straining to hear whatever had Sophie in its grasp. At first, there was only the soft hum in the air, that vibrating pressure in the bones. But then, there it was, a faint whisper carried on the fog, barely louder than a breath. "Sophie, come out, Sophie." The voice was soft, coaxing, almost sweet, like a lullaby sung through clenched teeth. It drifted from nowhere and everywhere, slipping through the seams of the car, seeping into their skin. Thomas's chest tightened, his hands clenched the steering wheel, so tight his knuckles ached. Emily's eyes were wide, her face pale and streaked with silent tears. She held Sophie tightly, rocking her gently, whispering her name over and over like a charm against the dark. But Sophie didn't blink. She stared through the window, her breath fogging the glass in slow, even bursts. Thomas's heart raced. He twisted in his seat, following Sophie's gaze to the window. And there, in the mist, barely visible, a small figure stood just beyond the glass. It was a child, a girl, maybe 8 or 9. Her dress was tattered and stained, her hair tangled and matted. She stood barefoot on the gravel, her skin pale, almost gray, her eyes dark and hollow. She stared at Sophie, her lips curled into a small, sad smile. Sophie's lips moved again, her voice a thin, trembling whisper, "She's calling me." Thomas reached across Emily, placing a shaking hand on Sophie's shoulder. "No, baby. Stay with us. Don't listen." His voice was hoarse, barely holding together. The girl in the fog tilted her head, her expression unchanged. Slowly, she lifted a hand and pressed her small, pale palm against the window, leaving a faint, wet print on the glass. Thomas jerked back. Emily let out a sharp gasp, clutching Sophie tighter. And then, the girl in the fog whispered again. Her voice was impossibly close, as if she were in the car with them. "Come play, Sophie. Come." The fog pulsed thicker now, swirling fast around the car. The tapping returned sharp, rapid, insistent on every window, every door. It filled the cabin like the rattling of dry bones, a frantic rhythm that quickened Thomas's pulse until his heart felt like it would burst. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps. He gripped the key, twisting it in desperation, the engine sputtering, coughing, then catching for a moment before stalling again. The fog seemed to press tighter with each attempt, as if feeding off their panic. Emily's voice cracked. "Thomas, do something." The small handprint on the window smeared, streaking down the glass as if the child's hand had slid downward. And behind her, more shapes appeared, figures emerging from the fog, all of them watching, all of them waiting. A sharp click echoed through the cabin. Thomas's breath hitched. He looked down. Sophie's door lock had popped up. His voice broke in a harsh whisper. "No, no, no, no." Emily lunged for the handle, slamming her hand down on the lock. It clicked shut again, but Sophie's door handle twitched. From outside, Thomas's skin crawled. He twisted in his seat, staring at the door as the handle jiggled gently, a soft, almost playful movement. The girl in the fog pressed her face closer to the glass. Her eyes were dark pits, endless, hollow. Her smile widened, thin, unnatural stretch that revealed teeth too sharp, too many. And Sophie began to hum. A soft, eerie tune, the same broken lullaby Thomas had heard in the general store. Her voice was quiet, breathy, but the sound chilled him to the core. It didn't sound like Sophie at all. Emily shook her gently, her voice a frantic whisper. "Sophie, stop, baby, please stop." But the humming continued, and outside the window, the fog twisted and swirled, curling into shapes that almost looked like hands, reaching, grasping. Thomas felt a terrible certainty settle in his chest, heavy and cold. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. And Sophie was the invitation. Thomas's hand shook as he reached over Emily, gripping Sophie's shoulders and giving her a gentle shake, desperate to snap her out of the humming trance. "Sophie, look at me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. But Sophie's eyes stayed fixed on the window, her lips moving in time with the haunting melody, soft and breathy, as if she were being taught the song by someone or something just outside the car. Emily's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she tried to pull Sophie closer. "Please, baby, please, stop." Her voice broke, the words dissolving into choked sobs. The child seemed impossibly far away, her small body stiff, her eyes glassy. Thomas turned to the window again, the fog so thick now it seemed to pulse against the glass. The small, pale girl outside hadn't moved. Her hand remained pressed against the window, fingers splayed, leaving a faint, oily sneer on the glass. Her eyes locked on Sophie, dark and endless, as if she could see through her, see into her. And behind her, more figures had appeared. Shapes in the fog, barely distinguishable, but undeniable. They stood motionless, a silent congregation, their heads tilted in unison toward the car. The fog shifted, and the low creaking sound drifted through it, a slow, dragging scrape like heavy wood being dragged across stone. Thomas's stomach twisted. His eyes flicked back to the building they had parked near, the one with the locked door. Its windows were dark, but the sound was coming from there. A groan followed by the faint rattle of a chain. Emily's voice cracked in a sharp, desperate whisper. "Thomas, we need to get out of here." We can't stay." Her words barely cut through the rising static in Thomas's ears. The fog seemed to hum now, a low vibration that seeped into the cabin, into their bones. Sophie's humming grew louder, stronger, as if she were harmonizing with the sound itself. Thomas's heart raced, panic clawing at his chest. He yanked the gear shift again, slamming it into reverse, stomping on the gas. The engine roared, the tires spun, but the car only trembled, locked in place by some invisible force. The fog pressed closer, the pale shapes outside leaning in, their forms shimmering and shifting like mirages. Sophie's door handle twitched again. Then slowly, it began to lift. Emily screamed, lunging across Sophie to grab the lock, her fingers fumbling, shaking. She forced it down, but the handle outside kept lifting, inching higher, the mechanism clicking with unnatural ease. The sound was soft, almost playful, like a game. Emily cried out, her hands shaking violently as she tried to hold the lock down. Thomas twisted in his seat, his voice a sharp, pleading whisper. "Sophie, snap out of it, please." He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Sophie, it's just us, just me and Mommy. Please, listen to my voice. Come back to us, please." Sophie's humming faltered, her lips slowing, but her eyes remained distant, staring into the fog. Thomas felt a shudder ripple through her body, as if something invisible were tugging her away. His heart clenched, the cold certainty rising like a tidal wave something was trying to take her. And then, the door creaked, a soft sound unmistakable, as the lock beneath Emily's trembling hand slowly popped up. Emily sobbed, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, no, no." She tried to hold it down, but the mechanism slid free under her fingers, as if guided by unseen hands. Thomas reached across Sophie, slamming his palm down on the lock. It snapped shut again, but the fog outside seemed to pulse alive with anticipation. The small girl's face pressed closer to the glass, her lips moving in time with Sophie's, a soundless whisper in the fog. Sophie's head turned slightly, as if listening to some unheard command, and her small hand reached for the door handle. Thomas's voice broke in a desperate shout. "No, don't." He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but trembling. "Sophie, stay with me, please." He looked at Emily, her face streaked with tears, her breath ragged. "Hold her, don't let her move." Emily wrapped her arms around Sophie, pulling her tight against her chest. Her voice cracked as she whispered over and over, "It's okay, baby. You're safe. It's okay. It's okay." But the words sounded hollow, swallowed by the fog, lost in the low hum that seemed to vibrate through the car's frame. Thomas turned back to the window, heart pounding in his throat. The pale girl's smile had twisted, her mouth stretched impossibly wide, a thin, cracked grin that seemed to split her face. Her eyes locked on Sophie, dark and endless. And behind her, the shadows in the fog swayed, as if a silent wind passed through them. The tapping resumed faster, sharper, a desperate, frantic rhythm on all sides of the car. Sophie's voice rose in a breathless whisper, barely audible. "They're calling me, they're waiting. They want me to come home." Thomas's heart stopped. The fog outside the car pulsed again, and the pale girl's mouth opened wide, a dark void, as if ready to swallow Sophie whole. Thomas's hand shook so badly he could barely keep it pressed against Sophie's wrist. The fog outside was thicker than ever, swirling in dense clouds that seemed to breathe, shifting shapes and faces in the mist. The figures, dozens of them, stood just beyond the glass, unmoving, waiting. The pale girl's hollow eyes locked onto Sophie's, and the slow, awful smile on her face never wavered. Sophie's small voice trembled, barely a whisper. "They said they'll take me to the garden." Thomas's heart lurched, a cold dread sinking deep into his chest. Emily's arms tightened around Sophie as if trying to pull her away from the unseen hands clawing at the edges of the fog. Tears streamed down her face, her lips moving in frantic whispers, prayers tangled with pleas. "Stay with us, baby doc, please. Please." Thomas twisted in his seat, his fingers fumbling with the gear shift, the key, the locks, anything, any way out. The car's engine coughed and sputtered again, grinding with a metallic groan that sounded like something old and dying. The air inside the car felt wrong now, too cold, too thick, as if it were sinking into them, heavy with rot and whispers. The journal. Thomas's eyes darted to the floor of the passenger seat, where the dusty old book lay, the one he had grabbed from the house. He snatched it up, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The ink was faded, but one phrase seemed to leap off the page, repeated over and over. Do not open the door after dark. Do not speak the names. Thomas's stomach twisted. The names. He looked at Sophie, her lips still moving, silently mouthing something, whispering names she should not know. The fog pulsed again, a low vibration that seemed to shake the car. The pale girl outside pressed her palm flat against the glass, her hollow eyes boring into Sophie's. The fog coiled tighter around the car, pressing against it like a living thing, smearing damp streaks across the windows as if it were alive, watching, waiting. Emily's voice broke, frantic and raw. Thomas, do something, please. She's slipping away. Thomas flipped back a few pages in the journal, scanning frantically. His eyes landed on a passage, underlined and desperate. The fog is the veil. The garden is the snare. The children are the key. He stared at the words, his breath caught in his throat. The fog, the garden, the children. The tapping outside grew faster, louder, a frenetic rhythm that shook the windows. The pale girl's mouth opened wider, the dark void of her mouth stretching as if to swallow Sophie whole. The fog twisted around her, pulling in tighter, and Sophie's small body seemed to lean toward the window, her breath shallow, her voice a breathy echo. They're waiting for me in the garden. Thomas's heart pounded. He reached for Sophie, gripping her shoulders. No, you're not going anywhere. His voice cracked, but he didn't let go. Emily's sobs filled the car, a ragged, desperate sound that cut deep. She whispered over and over, please, please stay with us. The fog outside seemed to pulse with every breath, the shapes in the mist swaying, a dark, silent chorus. And then, the pale girl's eyes flicked to Thomas just for a moment and her smile faded. Her head tilted, as if considering him, and then slowly, she raised a single finger and pointed at the padlocked house across the street. Thomas's breath caught. The lock, the boarded windows, the door. The pale girl's mouth moved, a soundless whisper, but Thomas could almost hear it, feel it in his bones. The key, his eyes darted back to the journal, scanning frantically. His pulse thundered in his ears. There, scrawled in the margin, nearly illegible, the lock must be opened. The key, the child, the price. Thomas's hands trembled. He stared at Sophie, then at the house. The fog seemed to shift, guiding his gaze. The figures in the windows leaned closer, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. The pale girl lowered her finger, her smile returning, slow and dreadful. Thomas swallowed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a stone. The key, the lock. He had to open the door. But at what cost? Emily's voice trembled, barely a whisper, as she held Sophie tight. Thomas, what do we do? Thomas's eyes locked on the padlocked house. The fog coiled around it like a nest of snakes. He knew the answer, and it terrified him. The cold realization sank into Thomas's chest like a jagged blade. If he didn't open that door, the fog wouldn't let them go. They were trapped in this place, caught in a web spun by whatever dark force ruled Briar's Hollow. And Sophie, she was slipping further into that web, her small voice still murmuring, her breath shallow and quick. Thomas's hands trembled, the journal heavy in his lap. The words etched into his mind. The key, the lock, the child, the price. He stared at the boarded house across the street. The fog swirled around it, alive and waiting. The old padlock on the door seemed to gleam in the dim, shifting light, as if beckoning him. The figures in the fog leaned closer, watching, waiting. The pale girl's grin widened, her hollow eyes gleaming as if she knew the choice he faced and that he was already too late. Thomas's breath trembled as he turned to Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. Sophie lay slumped in her lap, her small body shivering, her lips still moving in that haunting, breathy whisper. Stay here. he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Don't let her go. No matter what happens, don't open the doors." Emily's eyes widened, her voice cracking. "Thomas, no, please," but he was already moving. The door creaked as he shoved it open, the cold air slamming into him like a wave. The fog curled around his legs, icy tendrils tugging at him as if trying to drag him back into the car. He pushed forward, boots crunching on the gravel, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might split his chest open. The tapping grew louder, faster, a frantic drumbeat that echoed through the fog. Shadows twisted on the periphery of his vision, glimpses of pale faces, dark eyes, twisted smiles that vanished the moment he turned his head. The air felt thick, heavy, each breath like inhaling smoke. Thomas reached the house. The door loomed in front of him, warped and weathered, the padlock old but solid. His fingers closed around it, cold metal biting into his skin. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of the years and the secret strapped inside. He glanced back at the car. Emily sat frozen, her arms locked around Sophie, whispering her name over and over like a prayer. The fog pulsed around them, the figures drawing closer, their faces pale blurs in the mist. The pale girl stood at Sophie's window, her hand pressed against the glass, her mouth moving silently, a dark echo of the lullaby Sophie hummed. Thomas swallowed hard, the taste of fear sharp and metallic on his tongue. His hands trembled as he pulled at the lock. It didn't budge. His breath hitched, a sound caught between a sob and a curse. The journal's words rang in his head. The key, the child, the price. He turned his head slowly, his eyes landing on Sophie. No, there had to be another way. Thomas's pulse roared in his ears. He glanced around, desperate, his eyes catching on a broken window just above the lock-cracked glass, the shards smeared with something dark and dried. A shape inside, a figure, half seen, watching. A deep, low toll echoed through the fog. The church bell. Thomas jerked his head toward the sound. The bell swung high in the steeple, its clang hollow and slow, reverberating through the village like a heartbeat. With each toll, the fog seemed to pulse thicker, heavier. The figures in the mist swayed in time, their eyes glinting in the dim light. The pale girl turned from the car, her hollow gaze shifting to Thomas. Her smile faded, her head tilted, slow and unnatural, as if listening to something only she could hear. The bell tolled again, and in the silence that followed, Thomas heard it, a whisper, so soft it was almost a thought curling in the back of his mind. "Open the door, before the bell tolls." 13, he looked at the lock, his hands shaking. 13 tolls. How many had there been already? 4. 5. The tapping on the window surged again, a rapid, frantic rhythm that shook the car. Emily screamed, holding Sophie tight as the fog pressed in, the figures swarming closer, their faces blurred but their smiles wide too wide. Thomas fumbled with the lock, his fingers numb and clumsy. It wouldn't budge. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging in the cold air. He twisted, pulled, slammed his fist against it. Nothing. The bell tolled again. 6. The pale girl's whisper coiled around him, curling into his ears, soft and cold. The key, the child, the price. Thomas's heart clenched. He stared at Sophie, her small face pale and still, the hum in her throat softening, her breath shallow. Emily sobbed, rocking her gently, whispering desperate prayers that dissolved into the fog. The 7th toll rang out deep and heavy. Thomas's vision blurred. His pulse raced. The figures in the fog swayed closer, their faces pressed against the glass, their hands tapping. Thomas's hands trembled violently as he grasped the padlock, sweat mixing with the cold air, slicking his grip. The bell tolled again, a deep, resonant clang sending a tremor through the fog, through the ground, through Thomas's very bones. The figures in the mist pulsed with the sound, leaning closer with each strike, their faces inches from the glass now. The pale girl outside Sophie's window pressed her hand flat against the pane, her mouth moving in silent rhythm with the tolling bell. Inside the car, Sophie's body grew limp, her head tilting, her breath shallow. Emily clung to her desperately, sobbing, whispering her name over and over as if by sheer will she could anchor her daughter to the world. The humming in Sophie's throat had softened into a faint, tremulous sound, fragile, fading. Thomas gritted his teeth, slamming his shoulder into the door in desperation. The wood groaned under the impact, splinters catching on his coat. The lock held firm, but the journal's words gnawed at his mind. The key is the child, the price. The ninth toll rang out, deep and heavy, vibrating in his chest. The fog seemed to shimmer, the air thick with static. The pale girl's eyes snapped to Thomas, her smile widening, dark and endless. Her finger pointed again, this time not at the lock but at Sophie. Thomas's breath caught. The realization hit him like Sophie was the key. The door could only be opened if he gave her up. A sob tore from his throat, raw and helpless. His body trembled with the weight of it. The choice was unbearable and thinkable. But as the 10th toll echoed through the fog, the figures in the mist surged closer, their faces pressing against the glass, their hands smearing long, dark streaks across the windows. The tapping grew frantic, a sharp, chaotic rhythm that seemed to pulse in Thomas's skull. Emily screamed, clutching Sophie so tightly her small form seemed to disappear into her arms. Her voice cracked with raw terror, her sobs breaking apart into ragged gasps. "Thomas, help her. She's slipping." Sophie's lips moved again, soft, barely audible. "They want me in the garden. They said I belong there." Thomas's vision blurred, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He looked at the lock, the house, the pale girl, the fog. He thought of Sophie, her laugh, her bright eyes, the way she used to hum softly to herself in the back seat on long drives. And he thought of the journal, the keys, the child, the price. The bell tolled again, 11. Thomas felt the weight of the fog, the eyes watching the time running out. He could feel the grip of the village tightening, pulling them all deeper into something they couldn't escape. Then his gaze shifted to Sophie's rabbit, the small, worn toy clutched in her limp hands. Its stitched smile, its soft, frayed ears, the faint scent of her childhood still clinging to it. Thomas's breath caught. The keys, the child, the price, or maybe a piece of the child. Without thinking, he lunged toward the car, yanking open the door. The fog roared in, cold and sharp, swirling around him like smoke. The figures in the mist recoiled slightly, their eyes narrowing. The pale girl's grin faltered, her head tilting, watching. Thomas ripped the rabbit from Sophie's hands. Emily screamed, clutching at Sophie, but Thomas didn't stop. His fingers trembled as he tore at the seams of the toy, ripping it open, stuffing spilling out into the air. Inside, something small, something hard clinked softly as it hit the ground. A key, small, old, tarnished. Thomas's breath caught. The pale girl's eyes widened, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. The 12th toll rang out. Thomas snatched up the key, sprinting across the street. The fog clung to him, thick and sticky, but it seemed to recoil slightly from the key, shuddering as he approached the lock. He jammed it into the padlock, twisting hard. For a moment, it didn't budge, and then click, the lock snapped open, the metal falling away with a hollow clatter. The door creaked, the fog surging forward as if eager to pour inside. The 13th toll began, deep and final. Thomas shoved the door open, and the fog rushed in. It surged past him, pouring into the house in a sudden, violent rush. The figures in the mist wailed low, hollow cries that echoed across the street, their forms twisting and unraveling, dissolving into tendrils of smoke that curled into the doorway and vanished. The pale girl at Sophie's window screamed a sharp, inhuman sound that sent chills down Thomas's spine. Her face twisted, melting into the fog, her mouth gaping in a soundless scream before her form broke apart and was dragged into the house, swallowed by the dark. The bell tolled a final time, and the fog began to lift. The fog began to thin, curling away from the car in slow, lazy tendrils that drifted upward and dissolved into the air like smoke from an extinguished flame. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on Thomas's chest for what felt like hours began to ease, though the ache lingered deep and dull. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale tasting of cold, damp earth and something sour beneath it. For a long moment, there was only silent snow whispers. No tapping, no tolling bell. The stillness was almost too much, a crushing quiet that made Thomas's ears ring as if the world itself were holding its breath. He turned slowly, his gaze locking on the car. Emily sat frozen, clutching Sophie's limp body against her chest. Her eyes were wide, red-rimmed, tears streaking her cheeks in silent rivers. Sophie was deathly still, her small chest barely rising, her breath so shallow it barely fogged the window. Emily's fingers trembled as she stroked Sophie's hair, her lips moving in silent prayers that seemed too small against the enormity of the darkness they had just faced. Thomas stumbled toward them, his legs weak, the key still clutched in his shaking hand. The fog had retreated to the edges of the street, curling in dark wisps at the corners of buildings, as if watching from a distance. The figures, the pale, hollow-eyed watchers, had vanished, dissolved into the fog's retreat like shadows at dawn. Thomas yanked the car door open, his breath ragged. "Sophie Beatty," his voice broke, rough and raw. Emily looked up at him, her face a pale mask of desperation and grief. "She's not," but before she could finish, Sophie stirred. A shudder ran through her small body, a soft, rattling breath escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, her eyes half-slitted and unfocused, her lips moving in a faint, breathless whisper. "Daddy, the garden, it's not gone." Thomas's breath caught. His hands hovered over her, afraid to touch, afraid to breathe. Emily cradled her tighter, rocking her, tears falling faster now, her voice a broken whisper of gratitude and relief. But Sophie's eyes, when they opened fully, were different. There was something in them, a shadow, a depth that hadn't been there before. Her gaze drifted past Thomas, past Emily, to the street beyond, where the fog still lingered in thin, curling threads. She stared for a long moment, her breath slow and even, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Thomas followed her gaze. The padlocked house stood silent, its door closed once more. The windows were dark, the boards weathered and cracked. The air felt colder there, heavier. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to vibrate in the air around it, a low, distant sound that buzzed at the edge of hearing. But the silence it left behind wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, thick with the weight of what had happened, and what hadn't. Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it over?" Thomas wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it, to cling to the hope that they had escaped whatever nightmare had gripped them. But his eyes lingered on the house, on the key in his hand, on the way Sophie's breath hitched just slightly like a ripple beneath still water. "Now?" Emily nodded, cradling Sophie tighter as Thomas slid behind the wheel. The engine coughed to life, louder now in the absence of the fog. Thomas pressed the gas, the tires finally gripping the road, and the car inched forward. Sophie's small voice drifted up, very above a breath. "They said they'll wait for the next one." Thomas's stomach twisted, a cold, sick weight settling into his chest. He glanced at Emily, whose eyes were locked on their daughter, wide and wet with tears. The car rolled slowly through the empty street, past the boarded windows and leaning signs, past the church with its silent bell, past the house with the padlocked door. The fog drifted back into the shadows, curling away like a retreating tide. But as they passed the house, Sophie turned her head slow, deliberate, and stared at the door. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and in their dark reflection, Thomas thought he saw something staring back. The fog pulsed once, faintly, almost like a heartbeat, and then the car moved beyond the edge of the village, the trees opening up, the sunlight breaking through the clouds like a sigh. Briar's Hollow faded behind them, swallowed once more by the fog. The road ahead stretched out, winding through dense woods that no longer felt so welcoming. The sunlight broke in faint streaks, dappling the cracked asphalt, but the light felt thin, weak. The car's engine hummed beneath them, a steady sound that seemed almost too loud in the heavy silence of their retreat. Thomas kept his hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the road as if afraid to look anywhere else. His breath came in slow, measured gasps, but inside, his thoughts raced in chaotic loops. Every few seconds, He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the fog chasing after them, or worse, to see a figure standing in the middle of the road watching them leave. But the road behind them was empty. The fog had vanished. Emily sat with Sophie in her lap, her arms wrapped tightly around the small, shivering form. She rocked her gently, whispering her name over and over in a soft, broken rhythm. Sophie's eyes fluttered half open, her gaze distant, her lips moving in faint, breathy murmurs that Thomas couldn't quite hear. "Daddy," they're still whispering. The words barely brushed the air, fragile as a breath, but Thomas heard them as if they'd been shouted. His hands tightened on the wheel. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, but every part of him screamed to turn around, to look back. He didn't. The trees thinned as the car pushed forward, the edges of the village slipping away. The road widened, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight of the fog began to lift. But the chill lingered in the car, a cold that clung to them, seeped into their skin, their bones. Emily's voice broke the silence, raw and strained. What was that place? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't know how to. He stared at the road, his breath shallow, the journal lying in the passenger seat, its pages fluttering with the wind from the cracked window. The words inside it seemed to glow in his mind, etched deep into his thoughts. The key is the child, the price. His eyes darted to the key, still clutched in his fist. It felt heavier now, as if it carried something more than just its weight. His stomach twisted. Beside him, Sophie stirred. Her small voice trembled. Barely a whisper. "I heard them. They're waiting for me, under the house." Emily's breath hitched. She turned Sophie gently, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. Her voice cracked. "No, baby. You're safe now. We're leaving. We're going home." But Sophie's eyes stayed distant, her lips curling into a faint, tired smile. "They said." The garden's still open. Thomas's heart clenched, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel tighter. His eyes locked on the road, refusing to look back, refusing to see if the fog had returned, if the figures still lingered at the edge of the village. The car crested a hill, and as they descended, the landscape shifted. The trees then further, and the sunlight warmed the earth in gentle waves. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, a sound that felt foreign after the suffocating silence of the village. The world beyond Briar's Hollow seemed normal again to normal. The contrast was stark and settling, as if they had slipped back into a different reality entirely. Thomas exhaled slowly, the sound ragged and hollow. Emily cradled Sophie, her lips brushing her daughter's hair, whispering soft reassurances that felt too fragile to matter. Thomas glanced at the mirror again. The road behind them was empty, but in the corner of the glass, for the briefest, breathless moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in the trees. A pale shape, a faint silhouette. Waiting. He blinked, and it was gone. Sophie stirred again, her voice barely audible. "They're still there, waiting for the door to open again." Thomas's skin crawled, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. His gaze shifted to the journal, the key, the quiet hum of the car's engine. The road stretched on. The village lay far behind, swallowed by the fog. But the chill in the air told Thomas the story wasn't over. Not yet. The road seemed to stretch forever, winding gently through the woods, the trees casting long shadows that shifted across the cracked asphalt. The world outside the car had regained its normal rhythm, birds chirping faintly in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze. But inside the car, the silence hung heavy, weighted with the memory of what they had just escaped. Thomas's hands trembled on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. The key lay on the dashboard, catching the faintest glint of light. It seemed harmless, small and unremarkable, yet it pulsed in Thomas's mind like a brand, searing the truth into his bones. They had unlocked something, and it wasn't done with them yet. Emily sat curled in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around Sophie, who lay motionless, her breathing shallow and uneven. Emily's voice was a soft, broken whisper, repeating Sophie's name like a fragile charm. The words felt thin, too small to fill the space left by the whispers in the fog. Thomas glanced at the rearview mirror again. The road behind them remained empty, the village long gone, swallowed by the trees and the mist. But in the pit of his stomach, a cold certainty called something was still following. Not in sight, perhaps, but present, a lingering breath on the back of his neck, a whisper barely audible beneath the hum of the tires on the road. Sophie stirred, her voice a thread of sound, thin and breathless. "Daddy, they're still watching, there." Inside the trees, Thomas's stomach clenched. His eyes darted to the woods lining the road, the dense trunks, the shifting shadows. The trees seemed to sway slightly, their branches reaching in long, gnarled shapes that curled like fingers. The leaves shivered in the breeze, but there was a rhythm to their movement, almost like breathing. Emily shook her head, tears streaking down her cheeks. "No, no, baby, we're safe now, we're safe." Her voice was high, cracked, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Sophie. Thomas gripped the wheel tighter, his pulse a dull roar in his ears. He stared at the key on the dashboard, its edges worn and pitted, the metal cold and heavy. His thoughts raced back to the journal, the words scrawled in frantic, desperate handwriting. The key, the child, the price. The memory of the pale girl's face, the too wide smile, the hollow eyes, surged in his mind. He could almost feel the fog pressing against the windows again, hear the soft, insistent tapping that had haunted them. Sophie stirred again, her breath hitching. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to fill the car, curling into the corners like smoke. They said the door wasn't closed, it just waits for the next one. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. His heart thudded in his chest, heavy and slow. The words echoed, sharp and cold, each syllable cutting into him. Emily's hands shook as she stroked Sophie's hair, her voice breaking into soft sobs. "Please, no more, no more." Thomas's knuckles whitened on the wheel. He felt trapped between the road ahead and the fog behind, as if no matter how far they drove, they were still caught in the grip of something they couldn't escape. A low sound drifted through the air, a faint hum, barely audible, like the distant toll of a bell swallowed by the wind. It faded almost as soon as it appeared, leaving only the rustle of the leaves and the steady hum of the engine. But Thomas heard it. Emily heard it. And Sophie, her voice barely a breath, whispered, "It's still open." The road stretched on, endless and quiet, but the weight of the village, its dark secrets, its hungry fog, its hollow-eyed watchers traveled with them, woven into the fabric of their lives now. The key on the dashboard glinted faintly, a silent reminder of the price they had paid. And the toll, it wasn't finished yet. The sunlight filtered through the thinning trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the cracked road. The village briar's hollow lay far behind them now, swallowed by the twisting woods, by the fog, by time itself. Yet, it felt impossibly close, like it clung to the back of Thomas's mind, whispering from the dark. Sophie stirred against Emily's chest, her breathing soft but steady, a fragile rhythm that Thomas focused on like a lifeline. Emily's eyes were hollow, her face streaked with tears, but her arms held their daughter tight, as if she could keep the fog away by sheer will alone. No one spoke. The road straightened ahead, a long ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon, where the light was brighter, softer, warmer. A bird flitted across the windshield, just a bird, and the sound of its wings felt almost too normal, too delicate for the weight they carried inside the car. Thomas exhaled slowly, his breath shaking. His hands loosened on the wheel, the muscles in his shoulders sagging as if a tension he hadn't realized was there had finally eased. It felt like they had left something behind, but not everything. Sophie's eyes opened slowly, and she gazed at the ceiling of the car, her expression distant, almost dreamy. Her lips parted, her voice soft, barely a whisper. "It's quiet now, but they're still there." Emily stiffened, her hands tightening around Sophie. She shook her head, her voice a fragile whisper. "No, baby, they're gone. It's over." But Sophie's gaze didn't shift. She stared at the ceiling, her voice low and sure. "They're waiting for the next one." Thomas's breath caught in his throat, a cold knot forming in his chest. He forced his eyes forward, staring hard at the road, at the sunlight, at the world that looked so normal, so unchanged. But his fingers itched with the weight of the key. It lay on the dashboard, glinting in the soft light, a small, cold thing that seemed to pulse faintly in time with the rhythm of the road beneath them. The journal's words echoed in his mind, looping like a whispered warning. The key is the child, the price. Thomas swallowed hard. His hands trembled on the wheel. He thought of the pale girl's smile, the figures in the fog, the slow, inevitable toll of the bell. He thought of the door closed now, but not gone. Never gone. Emily's voice cracked. Thomas, what if it happens again? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he kept driving. The road ahead looked clear, the sky brightening, the air warmer. But in the back of his mind, Thomas felt the village watching, quiet, patient, waiting. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the fog whispered in the leaves, waiting, always waiting. The car rolled on in silence, the wheels humming softly over the asphalt. Thomas's eyes burned with exhaustion, every muscle in his body aching from the tension that had coiled and knotted inside him since they had first turned onto that forgotten road. Emily held Sophie close, her arms still trembling, her fingers gently stroking the child's hair. Sophie's eyes fluttered half-closed, her breathing shallow but steady, her body limp against her mother's chest. Thomas glanced at the key on the dashboard, the sunlight catching its tarnished edges. It seemed smaller now, yet heavier, like a stone pressed onto his chest. He reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing the cold metal. As soon as he touched it, a faint chill seeped into his skin, a subtle, lingering cold that curled up his arm and settled deep in his chest. He let it go. The trees began to thin, the light growing stronger. The dense woods opened up into fields dotted with wildflowers, the distant sound of a river whispering through the grass. The weight in the air lifted slightly, though it never left completely. It clung to them, a faint pressure, a memory etched into their bones. Emily stirred, her voice breaking the silence. Do you think it's really over? Thomas wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it, but he couldn't. Sophie shifted in her seat, her voice barely above a breath, almost too soft to hear. The door is closed, but not locked. Thomas's hands tightened on the wheel, his pulse slowing into a deep, dull thud. He didn't answer. They passed a small sign at the side of the road, weathered and cracked, almost hidden by tall grass. It read, "Thank you for visiting Briar's Hollow. Come again soon." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat, a sharp, involuntary intake that left a hollow ache in his chest. The village had let them leave, but it hadn't let them go. The fields gave way to open sky, the clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. The world seemed brighter here, softer, the colors richer, but it all felt muted to Thomas, as if he were seeing it through a thin veil of glass. He reached across the seat and took Emily's hand in his, their fingers trembling as they wove together. Sophie's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing even. Her small fingers curled around the frayed edge of her stuffed rabbit. Clutching it tight, the car moved forward, away from the village, away from the fog. But in the quiet, in the distance, Thomas could almost hear it, a faint tapping, soft, slow, waiting. The road stretched on, long and quiet, lined with trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The sunlight warmed the car's cabin, soft and golden, filtering through the windows in gentle beams that caught on the dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Thomas's hands loosened their grip on the wheel, though the ache in his fingers lingered. The hum of the tires over the road settled into a steady, soothing rhythm, a quiet pulse that seemed to slow time itself. Emily leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed, her breath evening out as the tension in her body slowly melted away. Sophie shifted in her seat, her small form curling into the shape of sleep, her breathing soft and steady. Her fingers still clutched the stuffed rabbit, the frayed edges pressed against her cheek. Thomas exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that felt heavier than it should. The air outside the car seemed lighter now, the trees less imposing, the world no longer heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The fog was gone, distant, like a memory that lingered just out of reach. The road curved gently, the fields beyond swaying with the breeze, their colors muted and soft in the fading light. Thomas blinked slowly, his mind drifting to the sound of the bell, the whispers, the tapping. But it all seemed distant now, fading into the hum of the road and the soft, even breaths of his family beside him. He glanced at Emily, then at Sophie, and a fragile sense of calm washed over him. They were safe. The moment was quiet, peaceful. The world outside had returned to its normal rhythm, and the darkness, whatever it had been, had receded, at least for now. Thomas let the car roll on, the warmth of the sun seeping into his skin, the breeze whispering gently through the cracked window. The hum of the tires lulled him into a soft daze, and for a fleeting moment, it almost felt like it had all been a dream. The road ahead stretched endlessly, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, leading them forward into the unknown. And behind them, the village of Briar's Hollow faded into the trees, gone, but not forgotten.